The people who had the expertise in software didn't understand the problems that needed solving. And then the people who had hard problems that would be solved really well through technology didn't usually have the technology skills to realize it. And then getting those two people in a room and making them see eye to eye has been really hard because they're totally different domains. And now it's much easier to bridge that divide where people who have problems can just talk to AI to build out that specification. Welcome to Modern Logic for Your Business, where we talk about how to put AI and technology to work in real companies. I'm Andy Ron, and with me is Dustin Bruznak. Today, Dustin and I dive deep on a couple really interesting topics. The mystery house. Is it haunted? Does it have water slides? No, it has everything your business needs. What? We'll get into that. Also, we talk a little bit about Anthropic and the latest turns between them and the US government with regards to their premier model called Fable. That's right. And before we jump in, if you're thinking about how AI could apply to your business, we'd love to help. You can schedule a free 30-minute working session with Dustin or myself right now at molo.now. That's MOLO.NOW. All right, let's get into the show. Did you try out Fable?
I did for the 10 seconds it was available to us.
Yeah, I did too. And I'm kicking myself for not giving it a more challenging problem. I had to develop a plan. My thinking was I'll go into plan mode with Fable and then execute using Opus or something. And that worked out great, but it wasn't enough to know would it have worked just fine with Opus anyway.
I gave it a harder problem. Okay, I didn't give it a hard problem from your perspective, but I gave it a hard problem from my perspective, which is I was producing a sales one-pager for a specific client, right? So this is an example of where I think the future is going, where you create these artifacts that are, you build them, you have to send them out, you throw them away, as opposed to what we used to do, which is like handing around like a one-pager for a month and then try to reuse it with every client, right?
Oh, yeah.
And the difference was, so it got the content, it writes like Claude. So the writing wasn't particularly any better than the previous writing.
I agree.
But I think it got more of the content closer in the first run. But the thing that really impressed me was it copied the design of and branding from our website much, much, much more closely. Our designer really only had to tweak a few bullet points, as opposed to previous iterations with Opus and Sonnet. You would point it at the website and say, make it look like this, and it would just not really at all. It might have our logo. It might have one color.
I've seen Opus and Sonnet just make up new logos.
Yeah, exactly. And this basically came out in a sendable format.
Cool.
From the get-go. And I think you tweaked it, right?
Yeah.
Other than the designer coming in and tweaking the bullet points and you tweaking the text, the actual overall design was pretty
The language
solid.
was still flat. And I don't know, I haven't thought a lot about that problem, about how to get these things to produce language that's just not so tepid.
I think I use it as a first draft, and I always go over every sentence because and I hadn't with that because I basically
we were just trying to get it out there.
But it's still massively useful to get to that. What should I put on the page? Because it generally, with some conversation, breaks through that whole writer's block barrier that I can have. Yeah. And then once it's going, then I can write and tweak. And sometimes it gets a couple sentences right, and I don't have to change them. But I think, and I don't know that Fable is significantly better. The thing that I've heard from other writers, which I agree with, is the tepidness comes from the balance. It's got this sort of internal sense of tempo and balance that if you read a human writer, they are not, human writing is not like that. And the best writing is atypical. So it doesn't just follow the standards like E.B. White's elements of style perfectly. There are hanging sentences. There are shorter paragraphs. There are things that don't make sense or get cut off. And to some degree, that all style lives in those choices. And Claude never makes unique choices. It always balances the things out grammatically in a way that it, from an English comp perspective, is actually pretty good. But it basically eliminates all elements of style and leaves you with kind of marketing dribble.
But I feel like it was trained on a lot of marketing text as well. So
Yeah,
it's
agreed.
always hyperbolic, happy, but it's vapid and
So what you're saying is the
transparent.
text it writes seems like a machine wrote it.
Yeah.
That's the, and I think
And that's
what you get for having the
back
machine
to
write
this.
it, right?
It's a tool with something
Yeah.
it's like I'm constantly looking at either social media or something, and I'm seeing like these two polar sides where it's either this is the biggest thing that's ever happened or it's all terrible. And I'm in the middle, which is I see there are terrible uses of this. People who are trying to make it do what it's not good at or don't know how to use it effectively. And that is a terrible use.
Yeah.
But I also know that if you put in the time to figure out what's the right way to use this new tool, it can do great things. And I just quick segue. We never even said what Fable was. We're just assuming out there that everyone knows, but this is from Anthropic, and they were calling it Mythos. And I guess this is like the safe version of Mythos.
It was supposedly the safe version of Mythos, and we can get to supposedly in a sec. But like one of the other things I was going to say is one of the things that AI might do for us is point out just how much of our day jobs we're doing things like generating worthless text, because there are plenty of places where you can say, "Hey, Claude, write this for me," and mindlessly send it out, and that's fine, because the value of the transaction that you're committing with those words is not a high value transaction.
Right.
And it might lead to us communicating less, and this is the optimistic view, improving our communication, because if you can have Claude just automatically read something, send out a response and using an agent with no interaction whatsoever, you have to ask yourself, like, am I actually generating value in my business here? And I think there are some cases like that are really transactional, like calendaring. I want to get on your calendar.
Or an example that
things.
I had the other day is I'm managing a fundraiser for a nonprofit that I'm on the board for. And I wrote the first email, put a lot of effort into it, but like it doesn't get read. So I just said, I pasted the first email into chat or whatever and said, hey, can you just give me a variation on this? And since it was taking something I'd already written, the rewrite was still pretty close to my voice because it didn't really change that much, but it was just enough to freshen it up so that if people had seen the first one, they wouldn't feel like they were getting this exact same email again.
Yeah. Great. So it's still not, I think it's more of a first draft producer than a final draft producer. And that's actually fine by me. It's saving me so much time there that I think it's still valuable for marketing use. I think the more interesting thing about Fable is how little access we had to it. So when they first came out with it, they basically said, hey, we're going to give this to everyone on the subscription plan for 2.5 weeks.
Yeah.
And then we're going to remove it because until we see the volume of use, because it's an extremely expensive model to run. And then about a week into that, the U.S.
It wasn't even a week.
Steps
it was like 2 days. It was literally like 2 days.
And says, oh, there are security concerns, right? Which I don't know that I buy that.
It's setting an interesting precedent. I don't mind that people are being cautious, but also, what do they expect to happen? Models are just going to get more powerful. They can't just pick on Anthropic. And what does OpenAI do with their next model? Say, it's more powerful than our competitor? And then the government will be like, well, clearly it's not safe to hand out. Or do they say, yeah, it's not as powerful as our competitors, which makes it safe to roll out?
First of all, they put in a ton of safeguards. And when you read Dario's response to the government, these were some relatively minor jailbreak type issues. And those same issues could be reproduced with other existing off-the-shelf models today. The problem is the US government and Anthropic are in the midst of this legal issue around them being identified as this restrictive vendor. I think this was more political. I think the overarching issue of our models going to decrease our security is really interesting. But in this particular case, right on the back of the government basically saying that Anthropic can't be in the supply chain for the military, largely because they're throwing what I think is a temper tantrum from my perspective. This just feels Temporal proximity tells me that there's more political calculus in this, because the reality is when you look at the facts, they could reproduce the same problem with AI's model, and OpenAI isn't getting their models restricted, right?
And
So
I
something's
sometimes
happened behind
wonder,
the scenes.
okay, the fear is someone could use these technologies to learn about biological weapons or nuclear weapons and do something terrible. But I sometimes think if you were determined and you had funding, couldn't you go to the library already and learn a lot about that? Couldn't you
Yeah.
talk to people or do your own? I mean, it seems, yeah, let's cut off the easy route. But to a determined someone who wants to do those things, it's going to take more than just shutting one door.
Or if a
And
state actor like China, they
right.
can
And
just build their
so
own model, right?
Anthropic was doing, I think, a decent job of, you can't just go in and say, show me how to blow up the world and have it be like, step one, do this. It's going to
Yeah.
say, I'm not going to help you do that.
You remember when the Anarchist Cookbook came back, but in the early days of
Yeah.
the
Oh,
internet, it
yeah.
was a huge deal because it was this
Yeah.
thing where it told you how to make Molotov cocktails, it told you how to make napalm and all these sort of weapons. And the reality was, like, you could have found any of that information. The reason people were making a big deal about it at the time was it was a novel.
Yeah.
It was a novel thing that the internet was just bringing to the table for the first time. But the reality was, with 30 years of hindsight, it wasn't really that big of a deal.
Right.
It was
Because
just something new that people were concerned
the
about.
reality was,
Right.
if you were determined to do those things, there were plenty of mechanisms by which you could have learned that stuff. Just,
It's
you know,
not like
talk,
science is.
just go to the meetup with other people who think like you, and someone's going to know something you don't know. And how are you going to stop that?
It's not like the formula for napalm or chlorine
Yeah.
gas or mustard gas or what have you isn't excess. It's science, sometimes
Yeah.
settled science for 100 years, right? But I think
Yeah.
the more concerning implication that I think so that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be oversight, right? But I do think that
Right.
some of those concerns are overblown on that front. On the other side, I do think the cybersecurity concern is worth considering and being careful around.
Absolutely. Because we're in a moment of transition. So much is changing. Balls are in the air, and you don't want to just jump 2 steps ahead and leave a vulnerability that allows bad actors to wreak havoc. Whereas if you just given yourself the extra couple weeks or months to do that in a more studied fashion, that transition could have been done more safely. That makes sense.
Well, and just giving people time, I think, to harden the fundamental structural pieces of our system, like giving Microsoft and Apple and Google access to the model so they can harden their infrastructure.
I sort of wonder, will there be like a TSA pre-check kind of thing where, as a US based business, could you and I apply and say, hey, we're decent people. Look, we've been running a company for over 10 years. We're not interested in blowing things up. Can we get access?
Yeah.
And maybe it'll roll out that way.
I think very similar to some of the standards work we're doing. Like, you might have to, for some of the very high-end stuff, you might have to certify that you've got things like real-time auditing and go through these checks. But I think, by and large, what's going to happen is the hackers are going to get the tools, the producers are going to get the tools. There's going to be a constant battle in the middle, just like there is over other things like cryptography. Both will get accelerated. In general, we'll see is just a jagged deployment of the technology.
And then meanwhile, open source models are being published by China and so forth, Quen, and just a bunch of models. And those are not regulated at all because they're just out there. And if those things' capabilities are comparable to this thing that they're saying is so dangerous, then it's like the cat's out of the bag then.
It's just math. And that's the problem, right? It's if the math. But I think also the piece that I keep coming back to is we already have the tools in place to control and manage dangerous technology. We just need to use them, right?
Yeah.
This isn't any different. It's just maybe faster. It's a different technology, but like, we know how to regulate this. We know how to adopt it. We've had things in the cryptography space for a long time where someone will break a fundamental hashing algorithm, and suddenly all the passwords in the world are broken. And like, we've done this before, right? I don't think anyone needs to panic. I think this is an example of the U.S. government applying some political pressure for negotiation reasons. But as a business owner, I look at it, I'm like, yeah, things are going to get more dangerous, but things have been getting or have been more dangerous online for a long time now. And as long as you're doing some fundamental things and planning for your security and working with your IT company, I guess I'm more optimistic. This isn't like some doomsday scenario. It's something to pay attention to be aware of, and make sure that you're doing some of the things, and make sure that you plan for, okay, what happens if I do get compromised? And then let the government handle what happens if someone uses this to generate something truly terrible. And I mean,
Yeah.
the reality is, like, how often does something truly terrible, every few decades something truly terrible happens, right? But like the reality is we already have a security infrastructure and we have to trust that's gonna.
Yep. There's a lot of
you know,
people
use
keeping
these tools
tabs on these
wisely.
things. So it seems like what usually happens is someone gets access. They selfishly try to use it for their own gain by like installing crypto miners or doing a ransomware thing, which to the individual getting ransomed can be terrible. But on a nation size scale, it's not that big a deal. And then those vulnerabilities get patched and that gets shut down.
And I think just like with Y2K, the attention that this is bringing to certain elements of the infrastructure might ultimately create a hardening effect that's better, because we've been ignoring certain issues in our infrastructure for a long time, like the electrical technology grid, right?
I know.
And so
Like
we
how
start
many
looking
like
at that.
just basic practices. Like I think default passwords on, and people are learning because those machines that they can park on a freeway to say a lane is closed.
Yeah.
You apparently they just have a USB port on them, and you just jack in, and no one ever set the password. It's like
Doesn't
admin,
surprise me. It's like admin,
and
admin.
so yeah, and so people are just like driving up to those and plugging them in and putting a dirty joke or something on the sign. It's okay. We're all
Well, you
learning.
also have to look
Ha
at the impact of the cost of the security versus the impact of
Yeah,
the security, right? Like,
but what I'm saying is, in some cases, the tools are there. You just have to use them.
yeah.
You know?
And this is something we're seeing with WordPress websites sometimes. Is like you look at you, it's like you don't have to reach to some fancy new tool to compromise someone's website if their password is their birth date and their dog's name.
I know.
It's
Actually, I have a
it's
little anecdote on that, which is going to lead into our next topic. But we actually have developed a new tool, which if you're listening, you can go to it right now. It's scan.molo.now. It's a free tool we've developed that lets you look at your own website to see how are you doing on accessibility and standards and other bases to make sure that your site is squeaky clean, is accessible to people, and is safe. And what's cool about that website is it might help you find some vulnerabilities, but the way we developed it is in line with this really interesting article that I read recently, which was talking about the Winchester Mystery House. Have you ever heard of this, Dustin?
no, maybe vaguely in passing, but tell me more.
Okay, so it's a reference to this really interesting building in California. It was basically inherited by a widow, and her inheritance was entailed. So she couldn't do a lot with her money, but the one outlet for her creativity and to spend, as I understand, was that she could expand her house. And so she just kept building on new rooms, new additions, new projects, just adding all of the whimsy and weird things that appealed to her specifically. It ended up being sprawling. It had just bizarre lighting and rooms for like plants, and she was not a trained architect, but it ended up with 500 different rooms in it. Thousands of doors, 47 different stairways, and from the outside, it might seem like it was just this aimless, chaotic assembly of things, but actually, to her, it was the perfect way to organize her life and her environment with like high tech innovations, like push button gas lighting. This is before electrical, but there was like an intercom system. It had steam heating distributed throughout, so it was really it's
Tech.
high tech, and it served her really well.
So this
It's
reminds me of the study they did on people's desks, like their messy desks, and they found out that people's messy desks are actually a reflection of the way their brains work. And the messier your desk, it doesn't necessarily track to an inefficient workflow. The people know exactly where that piece of paper they need is in most cases, or at least which pile it's in. And so in a similar state, she was basically allowed to build a house that reflected her unique mental makeup, right? And like her
Right.
environment. Whereas you move someone else into that same house. So what
Yeah.
happened? Do you know where the house went? Like,
Well, so the house is a metaphor based on software development. So there's this iconic piece of writing from 20 years ago called The Cathedral and the Bazaar to describe the two major ways that software came into existence, say in the 90s and the early 2000s.
yeah.
The cathedral represents coordinated software development by industry. You think like IBM or Microsoft building Windows or Apple inventing Mac OS 10. Like these are highly organized plans from like a product owner, waterfall or lean.
The
Either
idea is
way.
if you're building a cathedral,
Yeah.
especially if you're building it prior to today, it was a multi-generation, 100
And
plus
you
year
needed to have a
build.
plan, an
Yeah.
architect who,
So
okay.
you may spend 10 years and get the best people in the world together to
Mhm.
design that cathedral. And then you start building, and you might not even see the end state of that cathedral to see whether you did a good job or not.
You could
Right.
say Mac OS 10 really hit mainstream in like 2002. And that was based on stuff that Steve Jobs started at Next in the late 80s. So that, yeah, like a 15-year endeavor. Now, there were releases of Next and OpenStep before that, but still, that's when it really hit its stride.
And it was also like extremely expensive, right? Like building an operating system is hundreds of millions of dollars.
Or probably billions today.
Or billions, right?
And then the alternative was this Bazaar, and that's the open source model. And this came largely out of academia initially, with the Berkeley software distribution was a free version of Unix, which was the big operating system, the commercial one. But then it extended into compilers and all kinds of development tools. The windowing system called X Windows was open source. And Linux, of course, today is probably like the preeminent result of this open source Bazaar model.
There are, I would say there are probably more computers running open source operating systems or open source technology now,
or
not,
components, because
right?
even Mac OS, which I'm saying is this cathedral model, actually has a ton of open source components inside of it.
And everything does, right? When we start with development, why would you start from scratch? You grab these libraries and use them. And then when you just look at any of the clouds, Amazon, Azure, or Google, under the hood, it's all Linux, right? Linux has really won that battle.
Absolutely. But it doesn't have like an architect plan. Linux did have Linus Torvald, he is basically the architect of Linux, but still he didn't write all the code himself. He's coordinating a group of volunteers to produce the kernel. And in some cases, those volunteers are actually employed by companies like IBM and Red Hat and so forth. But that's just one piece of when you talk about the Linux operating system. The kernel is just one piece. There are dozens, hundreds, thousands of other pieces of software running in there that are individually managed by other people. And that's the Bazaar aspect. And that not bizarre as in weird, bizarre as in a marketplace, right? All these different people are bringing stuff, and it's paid for in all kinds of interesting ways. Some are like donationware. I built this thing for free, buy me a coffee kind of story. Others are free, but you pay for support. So it's this really powerful, complicated tool. But to really get it to work for you, you got to pay us to get it installed and configured for you. Some are like freemium. It kind of works, but you really have to pay for the upgraded packages. Like we worked with this one called Odoo for a while, and it seemed great because it was free, but it turns out if you really want to use it, you have to pay for the commercial.
They have all these proprietary extensions because the producer has the license. So most of the time with open source, anyone who contributes, what they contribute needs to be open source or is completely closed source in the case of BSD or MIT licenses. But the reality, there's a lot of viral open source licenses where you contributed, it has to be free. But if I created the piece of software, I can license it under my own commercial license. And then I can build all this proprietary stuff that I can prevent access. Now I've given you the gateway drug. And that's
exactly. It's the classic drug pusher. Here, have it. The first hit's free, and now you want the full thing. It costs. So anyway, that's a long way of saying, what's this have to do with the Mystery House? We've basically been experimenting with what this article is talking about, and we'll link to it in the show notes. But there's a new way
cathedral, the bazaar, and now
the Mystery House is basically the new way of building software, which is you have an idea and you talk to Claude Code or Codex and you say, can you assemble a tool that works this way? And it basically can, especially when you point it at existing stuff. It's really great at borrowing, adapting, and converting. And so it can assemble a new spin or a new take on this tool to solve a problem just the way you like it. So it's got the gas lighting, it's got the intercom, even though that's way ahead of everyone else. And And so I've done this a couple times now. And I think the scan.molo.now is the first example. It's a free tool we put out there. Try it out. But we basically built that with not a lot of time ourselves, fingers at keyboard. It's our own mystery house that we assembled. And it's not the other one. Just this last weekend, I wanted to put together a family tree. Been thinking a lot about family in recent months. And I had one up to share with my family, but it was an instance-based thing. So it cost me a fee of $25 a month minimum. And just as an individual, I'm like, hardly anyone goes to this site. It's silly to have it up, spend that. I wanted a serverless version. And serverless basically means it's on demand. You pay for the back end. And when no one's at the website, it's not costing you anything.
Right.
And so I basically was able to build my own mystery house genealogical website by pointing it at the open source GeneWeb tool, which GeneWeb didn't fit my bill in a lot of ways. It was written in a weird language, I don't know, called OCaml. It required an instance. It was all in one. It was like a Swiss Army knife. It was a web server, a database, a genealogy tool, an API server, and a front end all in one. So
it was old. Right?
It was like
this monolith.
Yeah, it's this monolithic thing from 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I prompted Claude, and I had it running on my phone because Claude Code has this way you can check in on your phone. So I was in the yard playing with a dog or weeding. It had a question. I could be like, do this, try that. And sure enough, I now have deployed my family tree serverless. It doesn't cost anything. I went to AWS Cost Manager. It's $0.00. I haven't exceeded the free tier on this thing yet. And I probably won't, even if I share it with my 100 closest cousins, who now I know who they are because I can use my tool to find them.
So there's a couple interesting things that come to mind there. First question I'd have is, if someone had come to you and asked you, if I was like, I have a client, he wants to build a genealogy thing. He's using this OCaml based ancient solution. We want to modernize it. What would the quote have been what would your gut have told you reproducing that?
But that's interesting because actually I did propose there's a small foundation that the family organizes reunions once in a while. And just to host and run and configure that existing open source tool, I was like, I'd have to spin up a virtual machine. I'd have to keep it patched. I'd have to have monitoring on it. And then the VM is going to cost us at least probably $30 a month or more. I wanted to not do this half-assed if a client was paying me. So it came into the tens of thousands of dollars to configure all that, deploy it,
and then hosting
that's just hosting. And it turns out in just 1 year, it was way less for me to completely rewrite the software package using AI and then deploy it in this serverless fashion.
A couple hours, right?
And I was using Claude's, I think I have their $200 a month plan or whatever, $100. It's not super expensive. But I kept the one window I did this in open through the whole course of doing this. And it came to $1,200 worth of credits by their accounting. Although they didn't actually bill me for that because I'm on their subscription plan.
Right. Which is,
but basically would have been $12,000.
What you're saying is a year ago, it would have been tens of thousands of dollars just to deploy what you have. And
to deploy.
And in a day or a couple hours of tinkering, you managed to reproduce that technology and deploy it for $1,200 in credits, but really, realistically, a few $100 a month in token subscription, which we already have as part of our coding environment. So what does that mean from the perspective of all software? Because I can see that being a really good thing. And I could see it being a really terrible thing, because do we all then end up with Winchester mystery houses that we can't resell that are like effectively uninheritable, shaky foundations? So when the CEO leaves the business, now all of a sudden no one else can run the business, right?
This is, I think, the new level at which software engineers need to be thinking. And I've said this before in previous episodes, like the programming language of the future does not look like what we did before, because the new skill is that you are managing really complex software systems at a high level. You don't have time to go in and review every source code. You have to treat the source code more like compiled output. I never look at the
more like a vestigial artifact, and you're okay with blowing it away or rewriting it.
So which means you have to be really good about capturing the specification, like right now it's markdown, it's ad hoc. That hasn't been well defined. But I think in the future, the specification, the architecture decisions, and the things you have to keep prompting it. Like I'm on an engineering jokes channel on a Slack, and there's all these geeky AI ones. So one was like, I am a machine that turns, and then they put a quote. What did you forget? Make sure you ran all the unit tests. And did you actually follow the specification? That's the end quote. Into high quality code. Because one of the problems with the current coding systems is they tend to drift towards lazy and incomplete. And I've seen this where I will say, match all the front end features of GeneWeb in the new thing. I did it, and I'm like, oh, but you couldn't edit. You could only see individuals. You couldn't see families. Like all these things were missing, and you have to point it out. And it's, oh, yeah, you're right. I did forget that. Or another time, all my unit tests were failing, and continuous integration didn't find it. And I found that it had just carefully put in or echo, basically, that's fine. And that little line is basically the way of saying, just ignore what happened on the test. If they all failed, just say it was fine. And so then all the check marks were green. Everything's fine. It's just like when you plug your ears and go, la, la, I can't hear you. It will do that to you. And so we have to figure out a way to make sure that it can't get lazy on us or
persnickety or all still matters.
This is why, unfortunately, it's not a panacea. You can't just replace people with these tools. Instead, you need to learn new skills to use them so that you can get good stuff.
My argument is if you've compressed the expense window from what I'm hearing would be a 6-figure rebuild project into a $1,200 rebuild project, that leaves you a lot of room, time, money, and effort to get it right. So now you're taking a 6-month project and turning it into a couple week project or a month project. Yeah. And as we develop the skills to know where these things get, as the models get better, and we develop the skills to validate, verify, instruct up front, as we develop new processes for these things, you're going to be able to close that gap, I think, even faster. You know what this reminds me of, actually? This reminds me of the early days of my career when I would go into, this was before what I met you at Adobe. So I'm this young punk. I'm like 22 years old. I just got, and I went into businesses, and I would say basically the equivalent of show me your spreadsheets. And businesses would then show me their spreadsheets, and I would automate their spreadsheets. And that was what I did for the first few years of my career, which was, from a coding perspective, incredibly easy. But what I realized was that almost every business in the world is already writing bespoke software all the time. They've been doing it in Excel for decades.
Yeah.
And so much of our business systems live inside of spreadsheets. That was the power of spreadsheets.
Yeah.
And so we have just, I think of this vibe coding as a natural next step when you can give everyone, or most of the desk people with enough training, can write software. And we're going to end up with all these little solutions and some bigger solutions. And then there's going to be a need for professionals to come and say, okay, you've got this system now let's let it grow up and actually.
Or honestly, I think another way, Dustin, that we can be of help to businesses is set them up with the bones of a thing that can be deployed. It knows about how to test it. Because what I found, when you set the coding agents loose on a well-founded infrastructure, the bones are there. It can build out the flesh of the body much better than if you just have it go. Then if you just let it go, you end up with the shambling mound from D&D. It's just monstrous Frankenstein-like things stitched together. But if you do have some well-intentioned design up front, here's the foundation or the bones or the infrastructure or the skeleton, whatever you call it, it is able to tackle those small pieces of, okay, I'm going to focus. I'm just building, I guess, like morbid with the body thing, but I'm just building a hand right now, and I'm just building a foot. It doesn't have to try to envision the whole problem.
I only need one foot and one hand, and that's fine too. Right. I think the other piece where we'll be brought in is, so about midway through, right before I went to Adobe, I was at a place that the CFO was a spreadsheet master, but not necessarily in the best possible way. So about once a month, they would be doing month end, and so what they had is they had literally 100 different spreadsheets that everyone in the department had, that they put their own numbers, and then it would link together into one master finance spreadsheet. And inevitably, the CFO would be walking around cube to cube going, who fat fingered something into a cell that broke the entire finance system for our business. And my job was to take all of that bespoke coding and codify it into an official piece of software in their ERP.
Probably using Visual Basic, right?
That was Java at the time, but so we were actually replacing the spreadsheets. They had some real ERPs running on AS400s that I needed to integrate. So I was using real software. Visual Basic was real, but it wasn't. It was more. It's basic. The name says it all. Right. But I think there's going to be a case where we get brought in and we look and we have all this vibe coded stuff, and they're spending it more and more time band-aiding it and fixing it, and they realize, okay, this is not sustainable. It's like kudzu. We're spending more time burning the kudzu away than we are actually like getting to where we want to go through the jungle. And I feel
even
like
how
we're
you
going to be the
approach
team with the flamethrowers. Right?
Even how you approach a problem like that, like no one has to go and refactor that. Instead, what you would do is take an agent, a probably powerful model as you can get your hands on, extract the specification, and then say, all right, this was a real hodgepodge. What would be a sensible architecture to solve this problem? And then rebuild on that architecture. And that's how we all end up with well-architected, solid foundations for our own mystery houses for our business. And
this is what I'm doing with my own mystery house, Winchester mystery house anyway. So I've been clear, like my biggest vibe coded tool, because you guys don't let me touch production code, which is wise, is my productivity and management system. And I have basically a AI-based operating system that runs my day-to-day, and it allows me to do things like create that one-sheeter very easily without having to explain who we are and what we do and what I like and so on. But periodically I will point the highest end model I can find at it and say, look at this system from a base principles perspective.
Exactly.
And either suggest improvements or boil it down into a specification that I will then clone over and rewrite from scratch. And I do lose some things, but you end up with a more solid foundation.
And you're not the only person thinking this way. We just met yesterday with our friend Michael, and he was showing us his own mystery house ideas. And this guy he's an ideator nonstop. And so
he's on his almost as many startups as I have.
His mystery mansion was sprawling, but also really cool and solves a problem for him in a very real way. And it makes sense to him too. So instead of like, do you ever get that software where you're like, where did they move the menu item this release? Like when, okay, I can tell I'm old school, but like when Microsoft Word came out with the effing ribbon, which was probably 30 years ago. I think
anyone that's using Excel or
I don't want this. I knew all the hotkeys. I knew where the things were. In our own mystery houses, nothing's going to move unless I put it there, which is kind of
so. What we end up with is a world where bespoke software, just like today, actually, if you count spreadsheets, is probably the majority of software. And then you have production-ish systems that need to be reliable, that maybe experts coded, spent more time with. But I also think there's nothing wrong with buggy, fastly written, bespoke mystery house type stuff if it solves 80% of the problem and you know what the trade-offs are. And I think I'm actually excited because this is going to democratize even more stuff for your average office worker to be able to automate where they used to be able to. How many things have we bid in the last 20 years that were just prohibitively expensive to even get started doing? And now they can come to us with a prototype and says, this works pretty good. Now make it that so dramatically lowers the cost.
I think the skill that people are going to have to learn is not coding, because the agent can code. The skill that people have to learn is how to be a QA, how to quality check that what it did works correctly. Because so many of us are used to looking at computers and thinking, oh, it must be doing it right. It's me. I don't understand. That's the natural. When I work with someone who's working with software, that's their natural tendency. And I have to tell people, like, no, software has bugs. It always has bugs. Did you try reloading the page? Did you try typing it and then deleting it and typing it again? There's kind of nonsensical things that you're like, why would you do that? And I'd be like, because software has bugs. And the person who wrote the key handler.
You remember the old adage, your compiler is not broken unless it is. As a classic pragmatic programmer, like the compilers are what we use to produce. It takes our code and turns it into software. for that the computer can understand it. And there was this adage in the Pragmatic Programmer, the first version, is, your compiler isn't broken. It's probably a bug you wrote. And then the next page says, until it is. And I can't tell you, in my whole career, I have run into probably a dozen times the compiler is actually
I've definitely run into times, but sometimes it's way simpler than that. Just yesterday, I was working with Anna. This thing was totally broken. We had to get our heads together in the room. And then I was like, let me just try copying and pasting the URL in again to the field. And when I pasted it in, the whole thing just shifted to the left, like by 4 pixels. There was a space character before the H in HTTP. And whoever coded this up never thought to strip white space before trying to process the URL. And space HTTP is not a valid scheme. So internally, it was just blowing up and the whole thing wouldn't work. But to an I, you wouldn't know that.
Yeah, classic.
And that's a pretty subtle bug in terms of the person who coded that form to think, oh, what if there's a space before it? And why,
This is why I'm so excited about not writing software and letting AI do it, is that level of pedantic nature of computers. It gets to be really frustrating, even for people who are really good at coding like us.
Well,
right?
But my fear is, at least in the short term, we all have to learn those skills, because the AI will be like, it totally works. It's totally, I don't see why you're having a problem with this webhook. The Codex wouldn't think, oh, maybe I should strip white space off the input in case they pasted in a URL with a space at the beginning.
It's actually really funny, because this is something that I am fixing in my systems all the time using, and I'll be like, okay, why did you have this error? And then Claude will helpfully come back and say, oh, we didn't strip white space, or I didn't strip this annotation. Or,
that's another,
you literally just wrote that. You just wrote
that's another technique for the vibe coding systems, is not just unit testing, but instrumenting the logs on all the system back into the AI so it can iteratively and improve itself. Not hard to do, but again, for a layperson who's trying to vibe code, they wouldn't necessarily know to ask to do that.
Or having another AI, totally different model, review your original code.
And I didn't mention that part of my genetics project, but I exhausted my OpenAI Codex subscription for the week doing that, reviewing the one code with the other AI. It was really effective at finding problems. Pretty much every time I sent to code review on Codex, it found 2 or 3 major issues. Which is, I think it's really interesting. That's even a viable technique for improving quality of output, is to just pit 2 different AIs against each other.
And they tend to, but if you pit the same AI, it tends to like its own code, so it's less critical. It's because of the what it's not a liking thing. It's the way it was trained. It thinks this code looks good, where a different model thinks a different set of. So it has a more sort of critical Nate review of the way the code is structured, in a similar way to Claude writing being like the same. You point Anthropic or OpenAI at Claude writing, and it's going to have a different opinion, right? So I think the other thing I wanted to touch back at, which I think this is the more dystopian thing for me on what you're talking about, which is, you mentioned that everyone is going to need to be QA. And one of the things that I've learned through my career is that is a very unique job role. That is a very unique thing that requires a unique kind of brain to enjoy and to get value out of. And most people really suck at QA because it is boring and it is hard, and you're doing the same things over and over again. So are we just creating a world where we hate our jobs even more, right?
No,
because we're spending all of our time validating.
Because I think I've mentioned this before, and even this article we'll link about the Mystery House mentions this as one of their final lessons, which is, okay, we've diminished one piece of the whole process of developing software, but we didn't diminish all of them. And so proportionally, all the other components have gone up. So in the article, they mentioned that the limits of code are communication is one of their take homes from that. Because the more code you have, the more features, the more you need to explain it to people, the more feedback you need to gather. None of that got easier because you could write code more. But this QA piece is another one. If we don't build into the system a way for it to self-check itself, then all of that proving that what it wrote actually works is on us. And we'll be sitting there clicking on the button over and over, seeing if it actually submits. Did the email go out? All of that.
And then going back and saying, why didn't the email go out? And saying, and that can be really frustrating.
Yeah.
And I think the way I've solved that is, and we're getting long in the tooth on the podcast, but you remember the REPL loop, right? This is like classic computer programming. there's this idea of read eval print loop, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what we mean by that for people who aren't as nerdy is the faster you can see the result of the work you're doing,
Yeah.
the more quickly you can iterate, the more momentum you have. And so there
This
was a
is
lot of focus in software development early in the agile movement to getting the results quickly so you can see if there's a bug. And I think the version of the REPL loop that I'm seeing evolve out of the soup of it is you're doing whole chunks of the software system in one go in an hour or 30 minutes, and then you're reviewing it in one. So instead of focusing on one button and clicking that one button and so like, does this, because that used to be our whole job, right? For a whole day would be one freaking button. I remember once explaining to a client, oh, you're changing the nav. That's going to take us a week to do.
right. Yeah.
And now you can just basically say, I want all of these things. And you can go through and more quickly validate in aggregate, build a list of your concerns, send that list over. And so the REPL loop is just bigger now, right? And so
I think you're missing a key point, though, which is if the AI isn't getting the feedback automatically, then it's all on you to click all the buttons, because it just put 1,000 buttons on the page in the nav, and you have to click all of them yourself. But there are ways to let it basically virtually click the buttons itself, virtually send itself an email and verify that this is right. And the REPL loop absolutely is critical. It's the reason I'm a computer person today and not a molecular biologist, because 30 years ago, I was going to be a biologist, and I was sitting in the lab, and the REPL loop for that was mix clear liquids all day, some of them radioactive, in minuscule amounts, and then come back tomorrow and find out if it worked or not. And that was so tedious because most of the time it didn't work. If it worked right the first shot, someone had done it 20 years previous. So it was only the really hard, weird things that were left to do. And so the REPL loop is big in terms of user satisfaction.
I'm gonna have to spend 10 years staring at these clear test tubes to actually get to my result,
to mix them just right.
Remember to thank the scientists in your life for their work in that salt mine, right?
Yeah. Well, none
of us want it, right?
There are robots that do a lot of those things today, which I was dreaming about at the time.
I think the combination of sort of three things. One, a more coarse-grained idea of product, right? So instead of focusing on all these buttons in the right place, it's does the feature as a whole work, combined with upfront getting better. And I think this is one of the biggest skills at specification, so that you are leaving less to the AI to make out of whole cloth, because that's where it makes the biggest mistakes. But also things like, how do we piece this apart into modular functionality that we can more easily validate and test? So it isn't just one big page. One of the things in Michael, when we saw his review yesterday, was he's showing us his own Winchester Mystery House, and a lot of it was in one big, long, scrolling page. And that's going to be viable to have tons of bugs. So if you know that about software, you break it apart. And then I think adding automated validation loops on the end and knowing what good looks like. So those three things are the new skills to produce quality software. And there's a lot of skill in those pieces. And those have been skills that people have been polishing now for 20 years in software development that have just become extremely important. As we've lowered the cost of production, we've increased the amount of time we need to spend thinking and validating, right? Yeah. It's just so fascinating. But I'm really excited for we're going to see an explosion of software, right? And it's going to be good and bad. But I also think this, in a way, is democratizing a ton of access to the fundamental technology those of us who've been able to develop have had for 20 years to everyone. And it's lowering the cost to make all these things we used to have to say no to possible. There's going to be a whole bunch of startups that
and I also feel like
it's
solving another disconnect, which is the people who had the expertise in software didn't understand the problems that needed solving, and then the people who had hard problems that would be solved really well through technology didn't usually have the technology skills to realize it. And then getting those two people in a room and making them see eye to eye has been really hard, because they're totally different domains. And now it's much easier to bridge that divide, where people who have problems can just talk to AI to build out that specification. And if you need to, bring in the technologists to help with the foundation, the skeleton. and to troubleshoot
or the
hard
final
parts.
process, right?
And the final process.
So, like, how many startups have we talked to that were just dead on the MVP, and they just couldn't, because they were waiting and trying to find a technical co-founder? Yeah. Or vice versa, they're a technical person without a product co-founder. But most of the time it was a product guy who wants to change the world, but they can't find a technical co-founder. And they're trying to go get money so they can hire a team to build the thing. And now in a week, you can build a 70% prototype that you can then bring to your venture capitalists and show what you mean, and also probably start making money on. It doesn't, like, the thing about MVPs, they don't need to be perfect, right?
Especially if the thing you're building is like just a CRUD app. And the fact that there is an acronym for this style of app, which is create, read, update, delete. The fact that there's an acronym and most software developers roll their eyes when it's just a CRUD app. That right there tells you that this is not a hard software engineering problem. We've built thousands of these. We do that all the time. It's ridiculous that it still takes months to put one together. And the fact is, it's not. Now you can build a CRUD app in a couple of minutes, basically, because there was nothing new to invent here. It's all been done. Yeah. The REST APIs, the database patterns, it's all known. And then that frees us up, the creative software engineers, to actually tackle the more interesting problems. Like, this hasn't been done before. How do I lay out a family tree of 1,500 people on a poster? That's actually an interesting problem.
Think if someone were to come to us and say, okay, let's start we used to basically go into Figma and design a product and show them the screens. And before that, we had this idea of paper prototyping. We'd literally draw on napkins or sticky notes. And now we're in a world where in a week we can say, okay, let us go and take a shot of that. And in a week we have software we can run that and show you what we were thinking. Does it work 100%? No, but that's not the point. Like, the fidelity has moved from sketches on napkins to something that approximates the final product in a period of a week. Yeah. And it used to be 2-3 months for us to get to that stage.
So,
right? And so it's really exciting.
It is. And we're all going to build some mystery houses, and we'll just see where they take us. Mine will have water slides for sure. What's the key feature in yours?
What I want to know about the mystery house is how many rooms she built and had to demolish and rebuild because she learned something fundamental about
just keep
how
building
much iteration. I think I would have a theater room in my mystery house. That would be
that's no mystery to me. Yeah,
the big theater room, good sound system.
All right, this has been a great conversation, running long as seems to happen. So thanks for joining us, everyone. If you're exploring AI, you have something you want us to solve, it's an easy way to get the conversation started. You can schedule a 30-minute session with us right now by going to molo.now. That's MOLO.now. Also, if you leave comments wherever you listen to this, YouTube, Spotify, you can also find us on Apple Podcasts. We'll incorporate your questions into our next podcast episode. We'd love to hear what you're thinking. Yeah, just talk to us. So this show is produced and edited by Ryan Peterson, with additional contributions from Dylan Brusnek, Anna Spitz, and Beth Davis. Our AI mascot was created by the artist Becca Ron. Our theme music is Elastic Vibe by Ziv Moran. If you find the show useful, share it with someone who you think would benefit, and take a moment to rate and review it. It really helps. Thank you. Modern Logic for Your Business is a production of Modern Logic. See you next time.